All right. So you have 3/4 squared plus 1/4 plus 3/4 times a half. All right, and so the first thing you're going to do here is the exponent. So 3/4 squared means 3/4 times itself. So 3/4 times 3/4. And when you multiply fractions, you may it's a good idea to reduce first if you can. You cannot reduce here. So just multiply numerators. 3 times 3 is 9. The denominator is 4 times 4 is 16. So this part right here is 9/16. So can I what? Lighten it. That's about, if I move this, it's going to distort the video. So I'm doing the best I can with both of these. All right, and then so I'm going to write everything else over. So I have addition, addition, multiplication. So according to the order of operations, I do multiplication next. So I'm doing this part right here. So you got to remember from last semester that 3/4 times a half, just like we did the one a while ago with multiplication, reduce if you can. I cannot reduce here. So then you multiply numerators and then multiply the denominators. 3 times 1 is 3. 4 times 2 is 8. So this is 3/8. So this part right here is 3/8. So I get 9/16 plus 1/4 plus 3/8. So that's what I have. Now at this point, what some of you are doing is you're adding the numerators together and adding the denominators together. That's not what you do. When you add or subtract fractions, you have to find the least common denominator or a common denominator. But it's always easiest to use the least. So if you look at those denominators, 16, 4, and 8, what's the smallest number that those three denominators go into evenly? 16. So you're going to write 3 fractions with 16 as the denominator. So again, don't add these up. That is incorrect. So it's kind of like, and it's easy to understand why. You all know that 1/2 plus 1/2. If you have half of something and a half of something again, what do you have? A whole. You have 1. Well, if you add 1 plus 1, you get 2. 2 plus 2 is what? 4. Is that 1? No. So you know you can't add the numerators together and add the denominators together. That doesn't make sense. Okay? So you got to remember that when you're adding or subtracting fractions, you have to find the same partitions, the same denominator. So we just talked about the fact that the LCD here is 16. So you're going to write 3 fractions with 16 as the denominator. And so now you're going to write equivalent fractions. So from last semester, you learned about equivalent fractions. So 9/16, you want to rewrite 9/16 with the denominator 16. Well, it already is a 16. So 9/16 is equivalent to itself. All right, now let's talk about 1/4. 4 times what is 16? 4 times 3 is 12. 4 times what is 16? Let's do it again. 4. What I do to the denominator, I do to the numerator. 1 times 4 is 4. 8 times what is 16? 2. What I do to the denominator, I do to the numerator. 3 times 2 is 6. So 3/8 is equivalent to 6/16. 1/4 is equivalent to 4/16. Now can I add the numerators? Yes. 9 plus 4 plus 6 is 19. And then you keep the denominator. So you write this is your answer. Since this is improper, you can, if you want to, write as a mixed number. So 16 goes into 19. If you want to rewrite it, 16 goes into 19 one whole time. 1 times 16 is 16. Subtract, you get 3. So I get 1 and 3/16. So either one of those is fine. All right. So make sure that you know how to deal with stuff from last semester, because everything you learn each semester goes into the next semester.
Is this out the book or is this on the...
Say it again? What was that?
It's on what you just did. It's on the test we already took.
Yeah, I said I'm doing number 4 in worksheet part B.
I cannot see anything up there. I'm gonna get my glasses on the next week.
Okay, you may wanna get closer or something. Okay.
I tried to sit that way and I can't see it at all.
All right. Okay. Okay. All right. Now, any questions on the back page? The key is there. If the key didn't help you real quick, let me know before I move on.
You know, I think on here, just really forgetting, maybe sometimes you think you know it, and then you forget like that one simple thing, which is everything, like the LCD. You know, you can do all the other steps right, but if you're not finding that LCD and you're just adding, it just kills everything that you did.
That's right.
So for me, I know that's where I made my error, because I was
Okay.
I was like, yeah, this is good, but I totally forgot about that one key. Like, you can't add them, even though it's addition. And I'm like, oh, man.
You got to remember the rules for adding unlike denominators.
Right.
Okay. All right. Okay. Now we're talking about the properties. This is still section. What is it? Section 8.6. All right. So we're still talking about section 8.6. All right, so page 2, 8.6. All right, so again, make sure you're working on My Math Lab. It is assigned for section 8.2. So make sure you're working on it. And some of you still are not in My Math Lab.
Did you just post it today?
I think I did. I'm not sure. I thought I did it yesterday, to be honest with you.
I think you just posted it
Today?
today.
Okay.
Would you mind zooming a little bit?
Yeah. Did you turn in section 8.2 part B last class period? Those of you that are just coming in, did you turn in section 8.2 part B last class period? No? You have it with you?
Somehow, I don't want to forget. I picked up somebody else's paper. I guess they were putting it.
Just put it back in the stack.
It's not graded yet.
And put it in the
I
stack.
don't know how it got. With my
It's okay.
paper.
Okay. All right. Now, still in this section, 8.6, the direction says something like this. Direction says use, and you're going to see this on My Math Lab. Use the commutative and associative properties. Use the commutative and associative properties to simplify each expression. All right, so use the commutative and associative properties to simplify each expression. Okay. All right, here's the first one. So listen carefully as to what you have to do to get the answer. So it's number 18, and whatever page that is on, it's section 8.6. So you go to 8.6, look where the problems are, and it's on that page. We have r plus 3 in parentheses plus 11. R plus 3 plus 11. Now, at some point, and I want you to simplify this, at some point, right away, probably at least half of you know the answer to this. When I combine like terms, what do I get?
14.
The answer is not just 14. What's the answer? R plus 14. Okay, so you knew that right away. But what they want you to do is to actually, in your mind, know that you're using the commutative property or the associative property or both. All right, so you know the answer is R plus 14, but what property did you use? And so that's what you have to understand. Well, what am I using here to get that? All right, so My Math Lab, though, gives me the directions, and you have this problem, and you go and you write down the answer. Okay? The same thing on the worksheet. You have the problem, you write down the answer. But here's the work you are doing in your mind. So this is the work. All right. So if you look at this, I have 3 things, correct?
Yeah.
And what property do you think I'm going to use, the commutative associative property, to kind of regroup or something?
Associative.
The associative. So right now I'm grouping the first 2. So we learned last time that that's the same thing as grouping what? The last 2. So in your mind, this is what you're doing. You're saying, well, that's going to be the same thing as saying R plus, in parentheses, 3 plus 11. And now use the order of operations. 3 plus 11 is what? So I get R plus 14. All right. So right here, what I used to go from here to here, what I used was the associative property. The associative property of addition. That's what I used. So we learned about that last time, and that's how it's used in this particular problem. Now on My Math Live, you just write the answer, and on the worksheet for that particular part, you just write the answer. But keep in mind, there's no work to show for that part on the worksheet. Keep in mind though that to get that answer, that's what you use. You use the associative property of addition. You regrouped and you put 3 and 11 together. All right, so in number 24, let's look at that one and discuss it. You have 7 plus x plus 4. All right, and before we do that, it may be possible to use both properties to get what you need. Okay? Now, probably what a lot of you are going to try and do, now you know the answer to that one as well. What's the answer to this?
X plus 7, x plus 11.
X plus 11. Okay? 7 plus 4 is 11. Is that a 4? Yes. 7 plus 4 is 11. So x plus 11. All right. But they want you to think about, well, how will I use those properties, either one or both of them, to get x plus 11? So probably what property you're going to use first is what property?
Commutative.
The what?
Commutative.
Okay, so if you use a commutative, what would you do?
Put a 7.
Use associative and just put it in parentheses.
Okay, let's talk about the commutative first. I'm just trying to understand how you would use a commutative property. The commutative property says you change the order. That has to do with changing the order.
We took the,
So,
when we took the x plus 4, the x is in the parentheses, and we put it in front of the, when we answered it as x plus 11. Was that our way of using it as commutative, because we changed the order from being in the parentheses to now being first, the x?
to be in what first?
The x for our answer, because our answer.
No, I need you to tell me how you're using the commutative property here.
You replace the x with the 7. And take the x outside the parentheses.
Okay, so what some of you are trying to do is you're trying to change the order of these two things here. Okay, so you're saying, now look at this carefully. The commutative property says the order in which you add things does not matter, right?
Right, in the beginning or the end.
Okay, so what she's trying to do is saying put the 7 in front and back of the 4. So you're saying this. That's fine. You can do that. I use a commutative property. I change the order of the 7 in what was in parentheses. No big deal. But then how do you get that x plus 14? What else do you need to do?
Do the 4 and 7 parentheses.
Okay. So yes. All right. So I use commutative property to change this order. All right. That's one way now. I use commutative property to change that order. So that's commutative property here. And now what I want to do is, instead of putting the x plus 4 into parentheses, I want to put what? 4 plus 7, because that's what the associative property says. Don't change to, in order to use the associative property, leave the 3 in the order you see it, which I am now leaving it in the order I see it. But I'm going to put the 4 and the 7 together instead.
Where's x plus 14?
That's a 4. All right. So I get x plus 4 plus 7, right? So that's to go from here to here, I'm using the associative property. And now 7 plus 4 is what? 11. So that will be the answer. So that's one approach. All right, so one approach is to use commutative property first by changing the order of the 7 and what was in parentheses. So 7 plus x plus 4 is the same thing as saying x plus 4 plus what? 7. That's commutative property. But then I want to group the 7 and 4 together to get 11, right? So I got to change the parentheses. So that's the associative property. It's changing the parentheses, changing the grouping. Now the other way you could have done it is this. Now listen carefully. So that was the original. So do you agree, though, that x plus 4 is the same as 4 plus x? Yes. So I could have used that as my commutative property. So I could have said this. I could have said that's the same thing as saying 7 plus 4 plus x. That's still the commutative property. Then I just used commutative property. Yes. But what I want to do now is not group 4 plus x. I want to group what? 7 and 4. So now I'm going to put 7 plus 4 together like this, and then plus x. So that's the associative property. And now 7 plus 4 is what? 11. So I get 11 plus x, which is the same as what? X plus 11. Okay? So in that problem, you have to use both of them. So you have to understand how you're going to use the commutative property and then the associative property.
So like you said, anytime we're using the associative property, that's when we're changing the grouping or changing the parentheses.
Changing the grouping.
So if I know I need to change anything out of that parentheses and I want to move it around, that's considered associative property.
Whenever you change, if the order of the terms are the same and you change the parentheses from first to last or last to first, that's associative.
Orders of the terms.
Okay. All right, 22. All right, 1/8 times 8z. Now you know what the answer to that is. What's the answer to that right away?
87.
Say it again.
87 over 8.
80, that's 8z.
Oh, z, I'm sorry.
You know the answer to that. What's the answer? No, not 64z. See, now, you see, if you said 64z, and it's fine to say it right now, but you got to remember some things from last semester. How do I multiply fractions?
No, you gotta add the 1 under the 8.
So 1/8 times 8 over 1 is what? 1.
Yeah.
1 times z is what?
1.
1 times z is not 1. 1 times z is z.
1 times z is z.
1 times 5 is 5. 1 times 6 is 6. 1 times 7 is 7. 1 times 8 is 8. 1 times z is what?
Z.
Z.
Got it. You make it sound so simple. My last teacher didn't do that. It was hard.
Okay? Now, you know the answer is z, though. But they want you to use a property to get that. So look at what you have and tell me what property you think you're going to use. Associative. Because when we talked about this, we said 1/8 times what? 8. Well, those are next to each other. But now what you want to do is put them in parentheses together. So when I change the grouping, that's the associative property. So instead of having 8z in parentheses, I want to put 1/8 times what in parentheses? 8. Times 8. So this is what I want to have. And what property did I just use? The associative property. Now, remember, there's an associative property of addition and there's associative property of multiplication. And this one is which one? Multiplication. I did not use the commutative property at all because the order was already what I needed. The 1/8 and the 1/8 were next to each other. All I needed to do was use the associative property, and now I know that 1/8 times 8 from last semester is what number? 1. And 1 times 8, I'm sorry, 1 times z is what? Z. So when you do the My Math Lab, though, all they want is the answer. There's no work to show in My Math Lab for this, and also in the worksheet, there's really no work to show for that. It's not going to say show any work. But in your mind, I need for you to understand how you're using those two properties. How am I using the commutative property and how am I using the associative property to get the answer that I'm getting? Now, that's not an easy task. Yes?
How we got Z again?
I'm sorry?
How we got Z again?
How you got Z? What's 1/8 times 8? What's 1/8 times 8?
1/8 times 8 is... I'm not sure.
1/8 times 8/1. How would you multiply those two fractions from last semester?
You'll say, how many times 8 going to 8? You'll say 1, so how many times 8 going to the other 8? 1.
Okay, so you're reducing first.
Yeah.
Then what'd you do?
You'll do 1 times 1, which is 1, numerator, and 1 times 1, which is 1, which is the denominator, and it will equal 1.
Okay.
And then you'll do 1 times Z, which is Z.
Okay. All right. Okay, number 30. You have negative 1/3 times 7, that's a 7, Z. Negative 1/3, I'm sorry. Your book has 7x. So negative 1/3 times 7x. It's very similar to the one we just did, and the reason I'm doing that one, which is almost identical to the one we just did, is because when we did the other one, we could have reduced. 1/8 times 8 is just what? 1. So let's see if you remember something about multiplied fractions here. All right, first of all, what property are you going to use? The associative. So instead of grouping the 7 to the x, I'm going to group what? The negative 1/3 and the 7. So this is negative 1/3 times 7 times x. So going from here to here, I use the associative property. Now, got to remember, how do I deal with 1/3 times 7? 7/1. And I can't reduce, so I just multiply the numerator. So what's my numerator? And what's my denominator? 3. So the answer is negative 7/3 x. That's your answer. Negative 7/3 x. All right, 64. Okay, the directions here says this. Now you always have to follow the directions. Now, on the worksheet, make sure you're following the directions. So the directions will say this. Directions will say use the distributive property. Use the distributive property to write each sum as a product. Use the distributive property to write each sum as a product. Right, so first of all, let's think about the distributive property. Let's kind of review that first. So if I have 3 times x plus y, 3 times x plus y.
3x plus 3y.
So if I use a distributive property, get rid of the parentheses, you're going to say, remember the arrows, you're going to say 3x plus 3y, correct? What's happening now for this that we're about to do is you're going to be given this 3x plus 3y, and you want to use the distributive property to write it back as a product. So you're going backwards. So when you go backwards, look to see what they have in common. What do these numbers have in common? I mean, these terms have in common? 3. So in your mind, you know, well, here I'm saying 3 times x and 3 times y, so that'll be the same thing as saying 3 times what? X plus y. So in your mind, you're kind of visualizing that distributive property. Okay? So look at 64. 64 looks like this. 14 times z plus 14 times 5. That's a 5. So you can see where the distributive property comes into play. So if you notice those two terms, what's the same factor in both terms? 14. So what you had originally then was what product? 14 times what? Z plus, you don't say and, you got to say plus 5. Okay? So 14 times z plus 5. And always check yourself. If I use distributive property, do I get the original back right here? Yeah. 14 times z and 14 times 5. So that's the answer they want right here. So you took the sum and you wrote it as a what? A product. And what property did you use to get that? Distributive property. All right, 68. Same directions. You have negative 3a, like this in parentheses. That's the way they have it. Plus negative 3y, just like this. So they want to rewrite that sum as a product using what property? All right, so what do you think the answer would be? Negative 3 times a plus y. So the answer is going to be negative 3 times a plus y. Kind of makes sense because if you distribute, you get negative 3a, which is this, and negative 3y, which is this. All right, so when you do the math lab dealing with those directions or the worksheet dealing with those directions, that's the answer you want. All right. Now the other direction says this. Here are the other directions. All right, directions here is going to say this. Name the property illustrated by each statement. All right, so name the property illustrated by each statement. All right, now on my math lab, chances are it's going to be a multiple choice type thing. On my math lab. On the worksheet, it's not multiple choice. You're going to have to write out that statement. Don't abbreviate. On the worksheet, don't abbreviate. Write it out. So here's 72. All right, so this is what they have. They have 4 times 3 plus 8 equal 4 times 3 plus 4 times 8. So that's the statement. That's the statement. And they want to know what property allows us to say that the left side equals the right side. Distributive property. Write out the word distributive. Write out the word property, okay? Don't be lazy. Just spend the extra 3 seconds to write it out. So the answer is distributive property. All right, so that's number 72. All right. 74. Let's go to 74. So just naming those properties. That's all that part of the direction says. All right, 74. You have this statement. Looks like this. Equal. And then you have this. Okay, associative property of multiplication. So you got to say, don't just say associative property. You got to tell me, be a little bit more specific. That's the associative property of multiplication because the operation is multiplication. Remember, the associative property, all I did there was just change the grouping. I didn't change any order. 9x7, 9x7. I just changed the grouping. So that's the associative property. You thought what?
I thought you was the one when you went south. Oh, well, yeah, you changed the 9. So anytime you number that's inside the parentheses is associative.
Anytime you change the grouping, it's associative property. Okay? So instead of grouping x times 7, I'm grouping what? 9 times x. Number 80. That's a 9. A plus 9. A plus 9 plus 6 equal A plus 6 plus 9. I'm sorry, 9 plus 6, excuse me. So A plus 9 and A plus 9 is in parentheses equals A plus,
Addition.
what was that?
Associative property of addition.
Associative property of addition. Again, don't abbreviate. Write it out. Write it out. All right, so I'm telling you now, don't abbreviate. If you abbreviate on that worksheet when it's due, and I take off something, you're going to be upset.
I can tell you that associate will probably be spelled different every single time. I have to write it down.
Yeah, but you have it in front of you. So look at the spelling. And you can use your phone to Google how do you spell associative. And on the test, it'll be more of a matching or multiple choice in the test. So you don't have to worry about spelling on the test. Associative property of addition. Now, if you do mess up with the spelling, I'm not going to take off from that. I'm going to take off if you abbreviate or if you don't say associative property of addition.
Well, the handwriting will be really pretty.
As long as I can read it. As long as I can read it. 82. Okay, now listen to this one. That's going to be 11 plus r plus 8 equal r plus 11 plus 8. Now look at this.
Commutative property of addition.
Very good. I am not using the associative property at all. Look at what has changed. The order, the order has changed. 11 plus r is in the parentheses on the left, and what's in the parentheses on the right?
11.
R plus 11.
So
that's a commutative property. 11 plus r is the same as what? R plus 11. So that's commutative property.
So even though the grouping is different, as long as it's equal to
The grouping's not different. 11 plus r, r plus 11. Grouping's not different. The order is different. Okay, now, let's look at this. Okay, we're going to come back and then we're going to do number. We're going to do number 76. I'm going to go ahead and write 76 right now. All right, that means 1 plus 9 equals 9. Now that has nothing to do with commutative associative property here. It's a different property we need to talk about. We're going to come back and we're going to do 76, and that's going to be number 76.
Is that 1 plus or 1 times?
1 times.
Okay.
1 times 9 is 9. You know it can't be plus because 1 plus 9 is what? 10. Okay. So, all right, so there's something called identity elements. So let's talk about identity elements. Identity elements.
What page that is in the book?
Sorry?
What page that would be on?
I don't know what page that's on.
There's more that you can get up on.
Go back and look at what, number 76?
No, just that, the definition.
Well, it's somewhere in your book. It's somewhere in section 8.6. All right, so the identity element of addition. So let's talk about identity element of addition. All right, so the identity element of addition says this. It says, if I have the number 3, let's say, and I want to add it to something, and I want to get the identical number back, meaning I want to get 3 back, then what must 3 be added to get the identical, notice the word identity, to get the identical number back? 0. So the identity element of addition is the number 0. So in my math lab, they do ask you something about that. They'll ask you what's the identity element of addition, and the identity element of addition is 0 because any number plus 0 is itself. Hence the word identity. It's identical. Okay? So the identity element of addition is what number? 0. Let's talk about multiplication. The identity element of multiplication. The identity element of multiplication. What do you think the identity element of multiplication is? 1. So if I have the number 3 again, 3 times what is itself? Well, 3 times 1. So the identity element of multiplication is what number? 1. The identity element of multiplication is 1. That's a 1. Okay, so the identity element of multiplication is 1. Okay? All right. So there's a question in my math lab about this, and it has to do with this. So we'll say the identity element of addition is 0. And why do you think the identity element of addition is 0? Why?
Because your answer has to be the number.
Okay? Because any number plus 0 is itself, or that number. Why is 1 the identity element of multiplication? Because any real number times 1 is itself. Okay. All right. Now, let's see. Let's all right. Now look at this. Oh, let's go back to this. So for this one, where you have 1 times 9 equal 9, what allows us to say 1 times 9 equal 9? Identity element of multiplication. Now keep in mind that that's multiplication. Keep in mind that my math lab may use the word property instead. So identity property of multiplication, same thing. Okay, so element, if they use the word property, it means the same thing. The identity property of multiplication is the number 1. 1 times 8 is 8. All right, now, still dealing with section 8.6. There's something called additive inverse. Additive inverse. When you think of additive inverse, you got to think of the word opposite. Additive inverse, opposite. Think of the word opposite. So in parentheses, make sure you put the word opposite. So additive inverse means the same thing as opposite, but you have to, don't just memorize the word opposite. You have to know that mathematically that means the additive inverse. Additive inverse. So there are several ways that it could be stated. Last semester you talked about the word opposite. So last semester this is what you learned. You learned this. You learned that, number one, let's put this number one. The opposite of 4 is what? Negative 4. Okay? You learned. And really that comes from the number line, by the way, just so you know. If this is 0 right here and this is 4, then negative 4 is on the opposite side of 0, the same distance. All right? So that same distance idea.
So it's the exact same thing as the absolute value?
Well,
Oh, I guess
not quite, not quite, because the opposite of 4 is what? I'm sorry, the opposite of negative 4 is 4, and the opposite of 4 is what?
Negative 4.
Negative 4. But the absolute value of a number is always what?
Positive.
Positive.
Yep.
Okay. But the connotation, there are some hints to it, but it's not exactly the same thing. It is still talking about the number line and the idea of opposites on both sides of the number line, both sides of 0. So in terms of opposite and absolute value, you could say the absolute value of negative 4 is what?
4.
4, because the distance from 0 is 4. The absolute value of 4 is what? 4, because the distance from 0 is what? 4. But the opposite of 4 is what?
Negative 4.
Negative 4, because negative 4 is on the other side of 0 and that same distance. The opposite of negative 8 is what? 8. The opposite of negative 8 is 8. Number 3, the additive inverse of 6 is what? Negative 6, because additive inverse and opposite mean the same thing. Okay? So just know that the words opposite and additive inverse mean the same thing. Now, one thing you should recognize is that when remember the word, in the word additive inverse is the word additive, adding. So if I add two numbers that are additive inverse of each other, I'm going to write this out, but if you add two numbers that are additive inverse of each other, what's their sum? If I add two numbers who are additive inverses of each other, what's their sum?
0.
0. 3 and negative 3 is what? 0. 4 and negative 4 is what? 0. Okay. So when I add two numbers that are additive inverses, are opposites of each other, the sum is what? 0. So when I add two numbers that are additive inverse of each other, the sum is 0. And it kind of makes sense because if I take negative 8 plus 8, are those additive inverse of each other?
Yes.
Yes. When I add them up, what do I get? 0. Okay, so that's additive inverse. So that's additive inverse. Additive inverse, same thing as what? Opposite. The other kind of inverse you need to be aware of is multiplicative inverse. Multiplicative inverse. Multiplicative. I know some of these words are hard to pronounce. Multiplicative inverse. Multiplicative inverse. For additive inverse, what word should come to your mind? Additive inverse. Additive, no. Opposite though, right? Opposite. Think of the parentheses, opposite. But yeah, I mean, there is addition in that sense as well. Multiplicative inverse, when you think of multiplicative inverse, I want you to think of the word reciprocal. 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 So additive inverse opposites, multiplicative inverse reciprocals. All right. So from last semester, the reciprocal of 7/3 is what? 3/7. The reciprocal of 7/3 is 3/7. 2. The reciprocal of 5 is what? No, that's opposite. The reciprocal of 5 is what? 1 divided by 5. Because 5 is the same thing as 5/1, right? And the reciprocal of 5/1 is 1/5. The reciprocal of -6 is what? -1/6. -1/6. The reciprocal of -5/8 is what? -8/5, right? The multiplicative inverse of 7/9 is what? 9/7. So all I need to know there is that the multiplicative inverse means the same thing as what? Reciprocal. All right, now, you remember for the additive inverse, and the word additive is the word add. So if I take two numbers that are opposites of each other and add them up, I get what number? 0. If I take two numbers that are reciprocals of each other, like the one we just did, 7/3, let's do 7/3. So 7/3 times 3/7. And in the word multiplicative is what word? Multiply. So I'm going to multiply those two. And what number do I get when I multiply two numbers that are multiplicative inverses of each other? 1. You get 1, which is the identity element of multiplication. All right, so what I need you to know here is this. When you multiply two numbers that are multiplicative inverses, the product is what? 1. Product is 1. Okay. All right, now let's kind of review this for a moment. So in Math Lab, one of the, well, let's look at this example before we kind of review something. we're going to write this. See how I had number 5 right here? Let's put this to number 6. The multiplicative inverse. So you can see this kind of example in my math lab and also on the worksheet. So the multiplicative inverse of 3n is what? What do you think?
Negative.
No. Okay, so the multiplicative inverse of the multiplicative. No. You take the reciprocal. What's reciprocal of 3n? 1 over 3n. 1 over 3n. You wasn't loud enough. You wasn't loud enough. The multiplicative inverse of something is 1 over it, right? Unless it's a fraction, you just take the reciprocal. So if you had this, let's say you had 3 over, let me not do 6, let's say 7x. 3 divided by 7x. What's the multiplicative inverse?
7x over 3.
7x over 3. It's just reciprocal. All right. Okay, so in terms of letters, when you look at your book, when you read that section, in terms of letters, it's going to say something like this. The multiplicative inverse property. Multiplicative inverse property. It says this. A times 1 over A, and what do you think that's going to equal? 1. Because A and 1 over A are reciprocals, right? And when I multiply two things that are reciprocals, I get what product? 1. So that's a multiplicative inverse property, which says A times 1 over A equals 1. Okay? The additive inverse property says this. Says A plus a negative A has to equal what? 0. So when you add two numbers that are opposites of each other, their sum is what? 0. So multiplicative inverse property, additive inverse property. So multiplicative inverse property, when you multiply reciprocals, you get the identity element, 1. Identity element of multiplication. Additive inverse property, when you add two numbers that are opposite of each other, you get the identity element of addition, 0. Okay. So I want you to tell me what property this is. So the directions, I'm just say what property. Question mark. What property is this? 8 times 1 equals 8. Identity property of multiplication. Identity property of multiplication. Okay? Because remember, the identity property says any number times 1 is itself. What property is this? Negative 6 plus 0 equals negative 6. Identity property of addition. Now remember, on the test, you're not going to have to memorize all these. It'll be in multiple choice or a matching type. On the worksheet, though, it may ask you to name the property, but you have these notes to help you. All right. Okay, so any questions at this point? All right, so let's see what I can, we're not done yet, but let me just see what I can give you. So I'm going to go ahead and look at some worksheets that I think I can give you now.